let's move on to the next presenter, Seyoung.
Yeah, I actually have a presentation, so I'll quickly pull up my slides.
Excellent.
Could you tell me if my screen sharing is working?
Yeah, it's working.
Okay, thank you. So today I'll be briefly presenting about my essay. First, I'll talk about my topic and my motivation to write about this topic. Also, kind of a summary of my key findings or key takeaways from my essay, and finally, some closing thoughts. So, okay, the topic of my essay was the effect of COVID-19 on children's psychology. Psychology is defined as the study of mind and behavior. So, in other words, my essay was about how the pandemic affected children's mental health. When studying the change of children's psychology during the pandemic, I looked at two different aspects, the educational psychology and developmental psychology. Educational psychology involves the study of memory, conceptual processes, cognitive ability, and critical thinking skills that is used during students' academic life. I mainly looked into school reports or news articles about how students were suffering severe academic stress during the pandemic era. The developmental psychology explains the growth of a children, which involves one's social, emotional, and cognitive process. The main resources that I looked into were interviews or news articles in which students shared their experience of isolation and how they coped with emotional hardships such as anxiety. So after reading the description of the popular science section, I wondered what would be meaningful for the public to know about something that is related to COVID. I wanted to talk about something that did not receive much attention amidst of the chaotic year. So after reading through COVID-related articles, I realized that news articles highlighted the effect of COVID-19 on education, such as reduced academic achievement and emotional hardships that students face. However, only a few of them went into depth about the enrooted psychological consequences of the pandemic that might lead to extensive long-term effects. Realizing this gap in knowledge, I wanted to give a new insight into children's psychology from a more in-depth scientific perspective to show how students were immensely affected by the pandemic. So one of the structures that I used was the storytelling organization. And to convey my topic in an engaging way, I included short anecdotes from students that were presented in news interviews or articles. The storytelling organization portrayed the topic in an entertaining manner as readers were able to hear real stories from teenagers and how their experience of the pandemic was like. Some of the key findings from the educational psychology perspective started all the way back since preschool students. During the pandemic, there was a drastic decrease in preschool enrollment rate as parents feared the virus or knew the limitation of online learning. This was a major change to acknowledge as preschool sets the stage for children's future education and lifelong development. For example, one of the key things students learn during this time is phonemic awareness, which is the ability to recognize spoken language. Considering the fast development of young children, 1 or 2 years of educational delay could lead to potential learning difficulties. I also extended the effect of educational psychology throughout high school students. So among 75,000 high school students' responses collected from 2018 to 2020, 42% of the students reported a decreased engagement in learning, and nearly 56% said that their school-related stress increased since the pandemic. High levels of demotivation and poor online learning conditions naturally led to students' reduced academic performance, such as a drastic increase in failing grades. From the States, 42% of the students in Houston, Texas failed more than one class during the 2020 academic year. I concluded this section by mentioning some of the long-term consequences of the pandemic. First, the increased stress and disengagement in classes leads to reduced academic performance and learning opportunities. This also restricts a student's opportunity to discover their potential to discover their potential or develop one's knowledge. And some of the news articles and reports highlighted how this leads to difficulties in securing jobs in their near future. And if they don't have a job, it could also lead to it could also affect their economic status, which in turn affects, leads to like poor health, poor living conditions, and even higher crime rates. So from the developmental psychology perspective, one of the most interesting findings that I discovered was the different symptoms by age group of the children. So the National Child Traumatic Stress Network noted that the behavior and psychological impact of COVID-19 varies by children's developmental stage. Children in preschool mainly show sign of fear, reduced desire to eat, frequent complaints, and anxiety to be away from their families. In elementary school, students show higher levels of impatience, nightmares, and sleep deprivation. In adolescence, students suffer additional inactivity and isolation. So by looking at this overall trend, as children grows up, they tend to feel more insecure as their understanding of the experience of the pandemic are more direct than children guided by their parents. The most common and severe psychological symptoms that children experienced in all age groups was anxiety. So after looking at the consequences of COVID-19 from an educational and developmental psychological perspective, I presented one psychological treatment called positive psychology as a potential solution. So positive psychology focuses on students' well-being, emotions, creativity, and strength instead of focusing on children's problems. The key to positive psychology is not trying to diminish the negative emotions, but augmenting positive ones. The implication of positive psychology to education is called positive education. One popular activity in positive education is the responsibility pie chart made by Bounce Back, the first positive education program. The responsibility pie chart guides students to realize the three factors of negative situations: their behavior, others' behavior, and luck. The visualization of negative events help children to learn the controllable and uncontrollable factors. Providing an optimistic and objective view of their lives develops their confidence and responsibility. So after writing this essay, I thought that the CCIR essay competition gave me the opportunity to learn more about children's psychology and the effects of COVID-19. I was able to conduct some in-depth research about the field of my interest and realized the importance of understanding psychology as it relates to so many factors. As a student who also went through these difficult times of the pandemic, it was interesting to understand the underlying reasons for such anxious and isolated feelings that I felt over the past year. And I'm grateful for the opportunity I was given to present my study and findings through this popular science article. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seyoung. Okay, let's move into some judges' comments. Tom, would you like to go first again?
Sure, yeah, it's absolutely a brilliant piece of work and a very nice presentation as well, I would say. So one question I had, you mentioned about future job prospects, which is a really interesting topic. So I was wondering what difference it might make that so many people in your generation are in the same situation. So somebody might optimistically think there's not going to be a problem because everyone's going to be in the same boat, right? So everyone's had these difficulties, so nobody's going to be disadvantaged by having those difficulties. Do you think that makes it okay, or do you think there are still problems we need to worry about there?
I think I also briefly mentioned this in my essay, but I also talked about how like the severity of the difficulties that were faced by students also vary by their demographic groups. So one thing I found was that female students tend to suffer more emotionally since compared to men. So and also like students living in like poor regions or who didn't get like enough educational support during this era performed more badly compared to other students. So maybe like we still should be concerned about those demographic characteristics that like that kind of vary the effect of the difficulties. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, this seems to apply to a lot of things with the pandemic. It's wrong to think it's affected everybody in the same way, right? It might have affected everybody. It looks like there are clear differences in how badly it's affected people, and that can lead to inequalities later on. And I think with health, that's really obvious, but it's very interesting to think about it in terms of education and mental health as well. So I agree.
Thank you.
Hande?
Yeah, thank you. This was really engaging, both the presentation and the piece. So thank you so much. I especially liked the angle of the piece. What I was wondering about is, because a lot of the educational aspects that we're talking about during the pandemic have to do with homeschooling. So you just briefly had the role of the parents in the presentation, but I was wondering what you thought about the parent-child relationship within this whole equation. Do you have any insights about where it is or where it is going with the pandemic? What kind of impact it has on discussion of anxiety you had in your essay?
Sure. So, one of the findings one of the things that I also read about was how, like, due to the lockdowns, the time that children spent with their family increased compared to other years. And this also kind of augmented the effect of parents' emotion on children. So, one interesting article kind of um, said that children were like little sponges, like they absorb all the information, all the emotions around their surroundings. And during the pandemic, I think the biggest effect for children were their parents. So maybe like if the parents are kind of stressed about their economic situation or stressed about or like anxious about the situation, I think that that was kind of directly conveyed to the children, as children really easily sense their parents' stress or when their parents are unhappy. And I think like the bond between the children and parents became stronger, but that also negatively impacted the children since they were also exposed to those negative emotions that the parents had some difficulties coping.
Yeah, thank you so much. That all makes sense. And I think that's all part of this whole equation that we've been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you.
Danielle.
First of all, thank you so much. I really enjoyed both the presentation and reading the essay, and particularly this, what I call the journalistic style of storytelling to engage the reader, immediately backed up with evidence and data, which I really enjoyed. I have one question. So you briefly mentioned, and you already mentioned in your one of your previous answer, the fact that the pandemic hit different groups in different ways, and in particular when it comes to education opportunities. Have you thought of what could be some of the specific disadvantages that most disadvantaged in terms of socioeconomic in socioeconomic terms students have experienced? For example, thinking of homeschooling, remote learning, could you identify or have you thought of something specific, some specific issue for students in these groups?
So I think one of the biggest issue was kind of the internet connection. So most of the like all schools maybe experienced like lockdowns and they had to turn to remote learning. And so like internet connection isn't something that like all families have. And I think this really limited, like it didn't just reduce the quality of online learning, but it actually just closed down the opportunity to actually attend the classes in some of their schools. So I think just like the online learning, like remote learning process itself kind of just shut down the learning or educational opportunities for many students. So I think that was the biggest problem. And we weren't really prepared for these sudden lockdowns. And the school didn't have any time to prepare or support their children's. So yeah, I think that was the biggest problem.
Right, thank you. And one thing from my head regarding the missed interaction with other students, do you think that that was a problem, especially for students not coming from particularly educated family backgrounds? So the possibility to have interaction with students from more advantaged backgrounds in school. Do you think that this could enter the equation somehow? I mean, I don't know. I'm asking you what your opinion about.
So one of the factors that were highlighted was the parents' educational level and how that affected children. So I didn't really research in depth like how this relationship works, but children coming from a more children coming from a family with a higher education level tend to perform better. And maybe I think that's because they know the importance of academics, or their parents really stress the importance of doing performing well academically. Another guess is that parents who have lower education levels might still spend most of their days going out to work, and they couldn't support or kind of guide their children through these difficult times, and maybe that could have also affected.
Thank you. That's all.
Children.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. And are there any student questions?
May I ask a question?
Yes.
So then, do you have any suggestion on general on how to reduce or ameliorate the psychological or educational difficulties the students are currently facing?
So one solution was positive education that I mentioned earlier. I think, so personally what I think was that the main reason why children face these emotional crises was because they don't really talk much about their difficulties. We kind of tend to not talk about what we our inner conflicts, and maybe just opening up and admitting our difficulties and kind of talking to school counselors or parents, teachers, friends, maybe just being honest about our emotions could kind of just reduce those psychological effects of the pandemic.
Andrew.
Yeah, that was a great presentation. So I had a question. So in Canada, some of our elementary schools haven't really closed. They stayed open, and a lot of the daycares also stayed open. And I know you explained a lot about the long-term negative effects of the lack of interaction because these schools closed. I was just wondering about your opinion. Do you think the trade-off is worth it? The fact that we do keep some students in the schools for their education. Do you think that's worth some of the long-term risks? Sorry, if it's worth the risk of potentially exposing them to COVID-19.
So I would answer that it was kind of a risky decision, because although they were kind of they didn't have to cope with the online learning and the lack of interaction in online platforms, they would be exposed to other risks, such as the fear of the virus. And if they were if their schools were open during the pandemic, I guess that they had really strict regulations to keep their masks on, maintain social distancing, and that could those kind of strict and tense atmosphere of the schools could have still stressed the students, and I think those would have led to equal psychological consequences. So yeah, I think both has different long-term consequences in the psychological perspective. So yes.
have a question if that's all right.
Yeah, please jump in.
Do you have any thoughts on the impact on society from the psychological implications occurred because of COVID-19 on children? Like, will our society drastically change, not just because of COVID, but because of the psychological impact on children?
So I'm not sure about drastic consequences, but maybe because this we are also the future generation that would in the near future kind of lead the society, lead the economics, maybe the reduced academic performance or the number of students that were limited from such school education could affect maybe our economics or some of the learning outcomes in future education. So yeah, that's what I have in the top of my head right now.
Cool. So I don't think we have time for any more questions, but clearly, Seyoung, your presentation inspired quite a lot of curiosity and quite a lot of difficult questions too, actually. But once again, thank you so much, Seyoung. Another big round of virtual applause.